Hi, this is Sean. Here's my keyword outline. And the full sentence outline. Here's my keyword outline. And I would like to pay tribute to Frederick Douglass today in my speech. Good evening, historians. One person I would really like to talk about is Frederick Douglass. I believe he is one of the most underrated and underappreciated historical figures of the 19th century. Back in my junior year, I read his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, for English. I found the book very eloquent and moving, yet I never paid much attention to the statesman that Frederick Douglass was. I would now like to correct that mistake I made in my youth and pay tribute to the man Frederick Douglass was and his inspiration for us all. To start, Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in 1818. As he says in Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. Douglass was symbolically choose the day February 14th as his birthday. Douglass's mother was one of the very few slaves able to read and write, but tragically, as was very common back then, Douglass was separated from his mother when he was young. He would very rarely see his mother, who lived miles away. The wife of Douglass's master, Sophia Auld, taught him to read and write, but her husband made her stop. He feared that if slaves learned to read and write, they would do something dangerous like demand their freedom or be more informed. Unwittingly, Mr. Auld had only shown Douglass the power of freedom. As Frederick Douglass stated, once you learn to read, you will be forever free. Douglass taught his skills to other slaves for months until his slave owners found out and physically broke apart the meeting and whipped Douglass. As a teenager, Douglass was eventually sent to a slave breaker, Edward Covey, notorious for his barbarism and brutality even back in the day. Edward Covey attempted to physically and mentally destroy Douglass, but Douglass would not give up. One day, when he had had enough of Mr. Covey's abuse, Frederick Douglass physically confronted him, and after that day, Edward Covey never lay a hand on Frederick Douglass again. This experience showed that Douglass, no matter what the slave owners could do, would never give up his dignity and desire for freedom. In 1838, Frederick Douglass, with the help of a free black woman, Anne Murray, whom he fell in love with, would make his way to New York, escaping disguised as a sailor. Even though he was now in a free state, he was not a free man. His master could still put out a reward for his capture, but that did not stop Frederick Douglass, who was only 20 at the time, from fighting for what was right at the risk of his own life. After his escape from slavery, Douglass became an active campaigner against slavery as part of the abolitionist movement. He spoke at many anti-slavery meetings, moving the crowds with his speeches about the horrors he experienced firsthand and being a natural speaker. Eventually, Frederick Douglass made his way across the pond to the United Kingdom, where he kept campaigning for the abolition of slavery. British abolitionists eventually bought his freedom. Now, Douglass was legally a free man in the United States. In 1845, his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, was published, and it was translated into multiple languages, spreading his words of freedom and the brutality that was practiced in the United States to millions of people around the world. As one example of the eloquent orator and of Douglass's ideals, I would like to discuss his speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July? And in a meeting with a female anti-slavery society, he stated, What to the American slave is the 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. Douglass lambasted the United States for its practice of slavery, especially as someone who firsthand knew the brutality and depravity that it was. He further pointed out the hypocrisy of the United States in this practice. How could a nation that was founded on the ideas of freedom and that all men were created equal practice slavery even after multiple countries had abolished it? However, Douglass, unlike some other abolitionists, most famously William Lloyd Garrison, said slavery was against what the Constitution stood for, noting that, let me ask, if the Constitution were intended to be, by its framers and adopters, a slaveholding instrument, why neither slavery, slaveholding, nor slave can anywhere be found in it. Frederick Douglass ended this famous speech on a note of optimism for the future, urging for America to live up to its ideals and abolish slavery, but not only that, how advances in science, reason, and technology and communications would bring the world closer and result in freedom for not just Americans, but the whole world. To Frederick Douglass, championing freedom in the U.S. may have begun since the Revolution, but it was incredibly flawed right now. It wasn't going to stay that way if those who sought for freedom, for those who were not like them, kept fighting for it. In fact, in 1877, Douglass would show an extraordinary act of reconciliation and meet his former master on his deathbed. His master stated tearfully, "Had I been in your place, I should have done as you did." While Douglass would reconcile with his master, he and the millions of free blacks could never reconcile with slavery and the subsequent effects it had on the country, even to freed black Americans. The abolition of slavery was not the only issue Douglass fought for. He fought for women's suffrage, which is controversial even among feminists of the time. At the famous 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, as the only African American and one of the few men there, Douglass fought against even some of the women there, campaigning for the right of women's suffrage to be included on the declaration that resulted from that convention. As he stated, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color." Douglass, in fact, would pass away in 1895 after giving a speech to the National Council of Women to a standing ovation. He was 77 years old. Despite the circumstances Frederick Douglass was born into, he became one of the United States' most significant orators. Indeed, when his autobiography was released, many people could not believe that a former slave, had written such a beautiful work. Furthermore, he was the most photographed person in the 19th century, using this new technology to convey the dignity that was denied to millions of black Americans, and how even the racist norms of the day would never define him as a man, equal to all white men. And now, 129 years after his death, let us continue to honor the legacy of one of America's greatest statesmen by holding our chins up with optimism and striving for a better future for everyone. Until we are all free, none of us are free.